right, welcome to the stage, Simon Williams.
Hi, thank you very much. So I'm Simon Williams. I'm Chief AI Officer for Italic, and today I'll be moderating this panel. So in terms of session format, we're going to do a very, very brief round of introductions, and then we're going to jump right in. We're going to do 35 to 40 minutes of moderator questions, and then we're going to have 10 minutes for Q&A for the audience. And while we're having the session, I'd like to keep this as interactive as possible. If you have any questions during the time that the panelists are speaking, just interject it into the Q&A, and I will try to add it to the conversation in real time. So to keep it as interactive as possible. So in terms of my panelist speakers today, I would like to welcome Dr. Rhonda Peters. She is CEO and founding principal of Energy Consulting. We have Rajkumar Kuppaswamy, who is managing data scientist at Applied Materials. And then last but not least, we have Holt Bradshaw calling in from the US. He is principal consultant for Siemens PTI Consulting. I'll now go around the room and they can briefly introduce themselves. So Rhonda, we can start with you.
Great, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am actually calling in from India. Energy Consulting is based out of the US, but I'm often in India. I'm excited to be here and contribute to this important discussion topic. I've been working on the interconnection and transmission of renewable energy resources for 24 years, and more recently data centers as they're increasingly being paired together with renewable energy resources. My background is in electrical engineering with a focus on the technical plus the policy development of resource interconnection, and I founded Energy Consulting about 14 years ago to accelerate grid modernization with a focus on the transition to renewable energy. I have experience in all regions of the U.S. with a focus on the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO region, which I'll draw a lot upon today. Thanks.
Okay, Holt, over to you.
Sure. Thank you again for having me. So for those who don't know me, Holt Bradshaw, I'm with Siemens PTI. Siemens PTI is an independent and technology agnostic energy consulting firm within the Siemens family of businesses, if you will. We support energy suppliers, consumers, investors, and policymakers with energy strategy, development, risk management, generation, transmission, distribution planning, grid operations advice, and sort of engineering and load generation interconnection studies and that sort of thing. I've been in energy for over 35 years now, with about 25 in consulting in a couple different firms. Right now, I lead our technologies and alternative fuels practice area, and our work with data centers. A lot of it falls under my under my guidance, I guess. So we're actively working with utilities, ISOs, and data center owners to develop those strategies and projects as quickly and as effectively as we can.
Thank you, Holt. Over to Rajkumar.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity. Myself, Rajkumar Kuppaswamy. I'm a senior manager and lead data science at Applied, and I'm specialized in AI-driven solution for global trade and then semiconductor supply chain optimization. I have an extensive experience on machine learning, generative AI, and advanced analytics, and also I lead the development team within the Applied Materials.
Very good, thank you. And from myself, so I'm from a company called Italic. We focus on industrial grade AI solutions for heavy industry. Some of that is also within the utility space, and really trying to bridge the gap between large complicated problems and how to put them out into the field. So let's jump in, guys. So we've all heard about the rolling blackouts estimated to happen in the US in 2030. We have very currently in a period of instability within energy, so heavy price fluctuations, and this all falls in very nicely to this topic today, right? So very excited to get into this kind of big gorilla of a topic, and just as a preface, if you look at the history, right, of AI, and particularly in terms of the inference-heavy LLMs, right? So today we have close to 1 billion people using LLM tools every week. That's up from roughly 100 million just 2 years ago. So that's looking at a 900% increase, generating a few billion queries per day, right? That's a huge step change in a very short period of time. We're looking at like software level increases of consumption. So with forecasts predicting data center load to potentially double by 2030, this has started to back up for the interconnection queues, right? They've started to stretch beyond a decade to start connecting your asset to the grid. And I think it's fair to say that this is not business as usual for modeling grid planning, right? This system has started to collapse. And what was stable and predictable is now subject to a really unprecedented change in both demand and also variability, right? We'll dig into that later in the session, right? So today we're going to talk a little bit about how the hyperscalers are demanding power, and then to also understand the challenges within the utility companies tasked with delivering it. In addition, we want to cover the new commercial reality. Who pays for the rapid upgrades to the grid? How is capacity reserved? And what happens to the rest of the queue when gigawatt scale projects start to move in, right? So that's kind of the preface, and I'll jump straight into the questions here. So a question that I'm going to ask to all the panel: what specific grid architecture changes? So looking at things like centralized, distributed, microgrids, co-location, are actually viable to support gigawatt scale AI loads within the next 3 to 5 years? And to kick this questioning off, we'll start with Holt, and then we'll move around the room.
Sure. Well, I'd say all of those are applicable in different ways in different places. There are certainly places where utility connection makes a lot of sense, where there's the capacity available. Maybe data center owners don't want to own their own generation, for example, things like that. There are other places where data center owners just want to move faster, need to move faster, are afraid that the interconnection timelines are too long or too challenging, and are trying to beat their competitors to the market, if you will, and are willing to build their own assets. So those are certainly options. There are hybrid approaches that blend both of those. Often that depends on, again, speed of development, cost, and the reliability that you're seeking for your data center. So if it's a tier 4 data center, it's very different than if it's a different tier data center with a reliability requirement, kind of redundancy one would require. So all of those are at play. Each answer is viable in different ways for different customers, and they're all being employed today. You're also seeing a variety of interesting sort of temporary measures that worked right now, where temporary generation is being used to bridge the gap until substations are built and things like that.
Great, thank you very much. Rajkumar.
Yeah, I would categorize the grid architecture in 4 types or 5 types, like proactive grid planning, and then distributed microgrids and co-located generation, like renewables, gas, nuclear, and faster interconnection. And also shift from centralized to distributed and then intelligent grid. Centralized alone won't scale. Distribution is a key.
Thank you. And then over to Dr. Ronda.
Yeah, I would say definitely all of the above. Proactive grid planning is really critical here. Transmission expansion is greatly needed to accommodate this scale of load that's coming online. We all know it takes 5 to 8 years approximately to build transmission. So in the meantime, the temporary energy storage can help optimize the existing system. Microgrids can help. What we see is that renewable energy inverter-based resources can come online a lot quicker. Some of the fossil plants that are being planned, those have a longer timeline to come online, so that's a longer strategy. Fossil and nuclear resources, some of the fossil resources can come on quickly, like the RICE units. But generally, it's an all of the above. Faster interconnection process, that's a key piece here, optimizing that process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on.
Yeah, thank you. Just to ask a follow-up question on this one. So we talked about diversifying the energy loads. Who do we think, in terms of your experience kind of on the ground, who do you think should own this, right? Because obviously this should sit with governments, it should potentially sit with the utility providers, but it comes down to the hyperscalers. I did my time at AWS, right? Their business priorities are to sling to essentially sling compute as quickly as possible, right? So in terms of the panel's time on the ground, who do you think will end up kind of carrying the burden of this in terms of those three players?
I would suspect a lot of that burden is going to have to go back to the hyperscalers. At the end of the day, you didn't see it as much a couple of years ago. You're really starting to see it now. A lot of pushback from public utility commissions and the like about having those additional costs put onto ratepayers, and we've seen that in a variety of places, whether it's a new data center with a new connection or its own generation, or some of the new PPA signed with some of the nuclear facilities in the U.S. for that power. You're now seeing really significant public utility filings and pushback from ratepayer groups. It's hard to imagine that some of the impacts that the data center will cause to the grid from a technical perspective the solutions won't be borne by them as well. We're certainly seeing some new contracting mechanisms for them as well that acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's definitely a lot of national policy direction to ensure that they are paying their fair share. The cost causation is a long-standing principle that generators and load have been subject to. And it's definitely an interplay between the state and the federal. Anything that's on the transmission level, it crosses interstate transmission, is federally regulated, and that's where we're seeing a lot. But the states play into that as well, because they have the responsibility for resource adequacy and to meet those needs of that load demand. So it's very much an interplay between the two, and particularly in some cases where we're seeing the load and the generation siting together so that they don't inject power on the transmission system. It really, there's a lot of defining moments here in who has the oversight and how do we ensure that the long-standing cost causation principles are upheld. And so it's a mixture of technical plus policy.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. And I think in terms, to summarize that, it sounds like it's a partnership, right? Which typically it's going to be a partnership between government and enterprise. And those can be tricky beasts to manage, right? So I think we dive a little bit deeper later on in the questioning around how those partnerships can start to take shape. But yeah, perfect. Thanks for your answer. Let's switch it up a little bit now, right? So we talked a little bit about the macro problem, some of the policies, some of the challenges. In terms of AI itself, right? Can we potentially see AI being implemented to deliver a measurable impact in terms of energy efficiency for these data centers, right? Or even load flexibility? And how realistic do we think that is when we implement it to actually reduce grid dependency? I've seen a lot of talk about various companies and also the hyperscalers seeing at how they can move different loads around to try and do kind of load balancing. But how realistic do we think that is? And what do we think is the measurable impact of that as well?
Well, I'd say it's certainly realistic, and there's certainly examples of it happening out there. How far it will go is an interesting question. There are certainly data centers that are signing up for demand response programs and the like with utilities, which is a form of load flexibility, allows them to cut load at certain times that are critical to utility. And so there's Google and some others are doing that. I think you're also seeing them start thinking more and more about how they can change their load, their request load, and therefore the energy that's required for all that. Recognizing that they have the ability to some degree, at least, to reallocate those questions to different data centers and different locales. And I know it's being worked on. Others may have a more detailed view of that, but both of those are in process. What's the end point is a good question. How much flexibility is really in the system? I'm not sure anybody knows, but perhaps others have an idea.
Okay, yeah.
On the efficiency side, AI can significantly optimize the data center operation, and for example, improving the cooling system, and which accounts the larger portion of the energy usage. And also it enables the we can enable the predictive analytics, helping the utilities of forecast demand and prevent the work overload before they happen. So in such a way, AI can be very powerful on utilizing it within this optimization world.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Rhonda.
Yeah, I would say that it's absolutely critical that we have transmission expansion. That's a key need here, and planning in regard to that. So, for example, in the MISO region, they have the LRTP, which is a long-term transmission expansion planning. And while that's underway, we want to optimize what we do have. So AI is being used to help optimize the use of the resources that exist today and tomorrow as we're looking at building up for those larger transitions to higher loads in these out years. So, for example, the peak shaving, storage can be used, the dispatch. Utilities have been doing this forever, right? Because load is variable. Load has always been variable. It has daily, it has seasonal patterns, and so they know how to dispatch and how to manage the system. It's just taking that to a higher level as these large loads come online or offline. You have to balance that with more resources. Again, I think battery storage is a key player in this process, and AI is also being used in the interconnection study process, automating some of the power flow studies, both by the system operators, the utilities that are processing these requests, and also by the data centers and by the developers, the energy developers, to look at where they can optimize putting resources on the grid.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add here as well, we discussed a little bit this yesterday in terms of it's kind of a new paradigm, right, in terms of this technology. So we're very much at the forefront of it, and there are a lot of unknowns, right? So as the new chipset comes out, there can be differences in energy consumption. Not all chipsets are the same. Not all data centers are the same. So we don't have a large batch of history or historical data that we can use to start to optimize that. And I think over time, these are types of things and new technologies that can start to improve this, right, from the data center side as well. So, okay, very good. So let's moving on to the next question. In terms of, so as I mentioned in the kind of preface, we're expecting by 2030 data center demand to double essentially. How credible do we think the forecasts are in terms of delivery, right? So what are the real bottlenecks in delivering these data centers? Power, obviously, right? So we've touched on that already. Land, equipment, permitting, all of these potential things that could start to slow deployment. So, Holt, do you want to start with that question?
Sure. No, there's plenty of forecasts out there. Right? We're not short on forecasts that show a range of anywhere from sort of U.S. perspective, sort of 70 gigawatts to maybe 130 gigawatts or something like that in the next 5 or 7 years, all depending on scenarios and who's done them and what assumptions are behind them. One of the things that's become very obvious in the past, I'm going to say a year or two, is that these things are happening much slower than people think they're happening. If you look at the queues where data center loads submit to the ISOs or the utilities for interconnection, these things, a lot of the actual, a lot of the developers are more speculative, and the utilities themselves are discounting some of that, often to pretty significant amounts. And so they're not planning for that same level of connection, but it's still significant, right? So don't get me wrong, it is still a significant load growth expected, one like we probably haven't seen in 50 plus years. And we've got a system that's not really designed to change that fast, right? We've got a history of sort of a low, slow growth utility environment with slight changes in load over time and some improvements here and improvements there, and things like, renewables and storage coming in were some of our latest biggest changes that we've had to deal with, but they didn't change load so much. This is, the first big load change we've had in quite some time. And so the whole system has to change, right? And so there are certainly, those issues. And then there's bottlenecks. And you mentioned a few of them already. Can you get the equipment? There's real limitations on ability to get gas turbines and things like that. Can you get through the interconnection process? There's a lot of work being done to accelerate that process, but it still needs to be done right. And in some cases, there's going to be a higher technical standard for those for some other reasons we may discuss today. Permitting is certainly an issue. You're starting to see pushback from local groups that are saying, no, I want a 12-month, a 36-month ban on new data centers because we need to study them. We're not going to let anybody build them. We saw that with renewals. We saw that with storage as well, right? So it's not surprising that's happening. So all those things, water access, one of the big changes in cooling is liquid cooling is coming, liquid cooled chips as opposed to air cooled chips. It's going to take a lot more water to manage that. And that's okay, but we have to make sure we have the water and we can maintain that water.
Yeah, while AI and infrastructure are advancing rapidly, I would say the real bottleneck is not the technology; it's power availability. And the key focus, what we need to do is like power and grid capacity, primarily the bottleneck, and to grid infrastructure is not scaling fast enough, and interconnection delays can take 5 to 10 years. Uh, and to me, power is now a gating factor for AI growth.
Thank you, Rajkumar. Rhonda.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, the region, 17 states in the central of the U.S. that I work a lot in. In terms of load interconnection, they have a process called the expedited. It's an expedited resource interconnection for the loads, and so the normal load expansion process is an 18-month process, but it's staggered. It happens annually. So they approve the set of upgrades at the end of the year for the next 5-year period. It's a 5-year out planning period. In the expedited process review, they don't have to start at the beginning of the 8 months. They can start anywhere. They can start in September or, usually a little bit earlier than that for that December approval, that annual December approval. So I think in terms of load interconnection, that's being processed pretty quickly, but again, the transmission needed to support it can take that 5 to 8 years out to build. In terms of generator interconnection, there's a number of means to expedite that process as well. Yes, it's taking this 5 years out potentially, but again, I mentioned the use of AI, and there's a couple other tools that can expedite the generator interconnection process. And we're seeing nationally a push towards policies that allow for expedited interconnection requests. Those certainly have some upsides, but they have a lot of downsides too. In some cases, I would say that the impact to the queues and the downside is actually greater. It's a trade-off, and it's going to be more hurtful in the long run. But some of them, not all of them. It just depends. There's a couple different approaches. It depends on if they are an out of queue process or in queue. So as the generators queue up, they're processed within groups, and if they're still able to expedite and they maintain their place in the group, but they come online earlier, that is okay. But if they come in line and they take transmission capacity that those projects had already been slated to use, that's where those impacts come and where the trade-off is problematic.
And so who are the typical losers in that situation, right? So you talked about queue jumping, you talked about the disadvantages of that, because obviously you're going to have certain people who have applied and have to wait potentially longer. Who are the typical personas that would lose out in that scenario?
It's a lot of the renewable energy developers, but in the long run, there's a pipeline. There's a predictable pipeline of projects, and resource adequacy planning is done years in advance. And so as that pipeline gets disrupted, it's everybody. It's the states, it's the end consumer, it's the system operator, it's the utility. Everybody's going to be a loser if that queue is so disrupted. And we're already seeing renewable energy companies going out of business because of changes in policy, because of, their whole company, profit and operating is based on these margins that they make and going through a predictable queue process. And with that process being unpredictable because of this queue jumping, these out of queue expedited projects, which are predominantly fossil fuel based right now. But there's still you're seeing some energy storage. I think in this expedited queue, maybe 25% energy storage, which is helpful, and some renewables as well. But particularly if it's a fossil fuel that takes a long time to come online, then they're not going to have that early on. And it's taking up that capacity, and it's sitting longer than the renewable energy that had planned for it and would actually come online in just a few years very quickly.
Yeah, great insight. Thank you, Rhonda. So we touched a little bit on the developers, right? And I think Holt made a few call outs there in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Typically, a developer will have to be looking at things like speed and cost, right, to deploy these data centers. As you guys are kind of in the field talking to your customers, what is the typical strategy that they're using? Are they going grid first? Are they looking at behind the meter? Or, I guess hybrid is an option. How are they looking at renewables? Are they assessing this as well into the mix? Would be interested to get your perspective on this, and we can start with Dr. Peters on this one.
I think hybrids are definitely a very key player, because that energy storage is helping to balance, right? Because that is your most efficient, quickest demand response. It's a fraction of a second that it can change. It can either absorb power or deliver power as the grid needs it. And so hybrids that are storage based are really key in this, or the co-located or locating storage near a lot of renewable energy where there may be excess generation, where there may be curtailment. That's a really great strategy. It's certainly in all of the above, but I think that hybrid and that storage piece is absolutely critical, particularly because, say, one of these large data centers, as you noted, this is unprecedented. We have 1,000 megawatts, 500, if we have multiple of these, and what if they drop offline? And quickly, storage can respond. If it's set up and it's optimized and located correctly, it can respond to that very quickly.
And just to drill down a little bit into the storage techniques that you're seeing, what would you say is the most prominent? What are they assessing in terms of batteries? Hydrogen has been talked about as well. What are you seeing in the space?
Well, the biggest player right now is the 4-hour lithium-ion battery, but we're definitely looking at the flow batteries. Lithium-ion can be longer duration, it can be shorter duration. You can build to suit. So there's like the 4-hour, there's 6-hour, 8-hour, 12 hours, 24 hours. Lithium isn't going to get up to those higher 12, 24, but the flow batteries can. We're also seeing compressed air energy storage. We're seeing some flywheels coming in. I think it's an all of the above. There's pumped hydro, definitely existing facilities. Those obviously take a lot longer to build, but we do have a number of those across the country, and they're really being leveraged and utilized. It's an all of the above, but currently it's predominantly the 4-hour lithium ion, or approximately 2, 4, 6-hour lithium ion, and those can be stacked if you're able to manage it correctly in operations. A lot of the RTOs don't have the software to really dispatch that. They need to develop policies, and they need to add it into their market dispatch model, but it is very capable. It is very doable. We've seen this in the Cal ISO in California for sure, that you can stack up those 4 hours to get you through a nighttime or a longer period.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And I think that whole industry in terms of short-term power generation, it feels like that's going to spawn a whole cottage industry just dedicated to that problem, right? So I think that's some great insight. Raj Kumar, over to you.
Yeah, Simon, first, I think I should say it's a great question. From what I see is developers really balancing the speed versus cost. But increasingly, the speed is becoming the priority, especially with the AI demand. Traditionally, many started with grid first approach. Grid is the first approach because it's more cost effective, but the challenge is interconnection timeline, which takes several years. So, so what we are seeing now is behind the meter solution, which is like on-site generation, whether the gas, renewable, or even emerging nuclear options to accelerate the development.
Great. Thank you very much. Holt, over to you.
I think I just add from a storage in particular perspective, there's a number of different uses for storage here. There can be storage that you need to help support momentary millisecond type responses, and we can talk a bit more about that if we want to. And you can have storage for much longer term if your data center is intended to be, say, a tier 4 data center, where you're only allowed 26 minutes of downtime a year. Storage of gigawatt scale that will last long enough might start to be pretty expensive alternative. And that's where you're seeing some people think about some of the other options, traditional backups and things like that, which is all viable. I would counsel people to also remember that it's not just reliable generation, but reliable fuel. Right? If you're planning on fuel delivery, you've got to make sure you've got that for the same kind of period of time, right? And that could be diesel, so the traditional fuel, could be natural gas. And the challenge there is our natural gas system isn't as redundant as our power system. So, you've got to think about that, the whole supply chain, the whole delivery chain, if you're going to look for a long-term reliable solution to meet those kinds of reliability standards. And that's a standard, for example, that the federal government requires as a tier 4 kind of standard. But it depends on the use of the data center and what kind of downtime is permissible. That's why it's sort of each solution's a little different depending on what you're trying to accomplish at that site.
Yeah, that comes into essentially the SLAs of the hyperscalers or the data center owner, right? In terms of how much downtime they're allowed to have, etc. So, yeah, very very good. Just I'm aware we've mentioned interconnection quite a few times in this, and we're going to deep dive even further. So let me just spell that out, what that looks like in terms of a process, right? So it's essentially the full cycle, right, from requesting grid access to actually receiving power, right? And this covers grid studies, approvals, upgrades, the construction of actually the transmission and the substations if they're needed. And as we've mentioned, that this is very long time cycles, 5 to 10 years, which obviously is completely incompatible with the AI demand, right, that we have, where data centers really need to be online within 12 to 24 months to keep up with this kind of massive increase in demand that we've seen. So just wanted to shout that out for some of the audience who are not deep inside the data center world, basically. So digging a bit deeper onto this topic, right? So now that we've outlined that we have such long interconnection times, what do you think is going to change faster? Do you think the grid itself will start to change, or do you think that how data centers are designed will start to work around it to try and do workarounds and to try to find other alternatives? Or do you think that we'll get to a stage where these interconnection times will start to come down and the process itself will start to optimize? And we can start that question with Rajkumar.
So these are the fundamental mismatch. So what I would say is the grid timeline over 5 to 10 years, but AI data center need power from 12 to 24 years. So that's why the industry is moving towards a hybrid and fast to develop energy solutions. Uh, so the strong closing line for me is AI is moving at softer speed, but energy infrastructure is still moving at construction speed.
Thank you, Rajkumar. Holt, over to you.
I largely agree with that. There's definitely work being done on sort of both sides of that equation to accelerate. It's harder for the grid to accelerate, but so fast. Certainly, there's work being done at the ISO level, utility level. The Fed's pushing hard to accelerate the study timelines and make those study requirements more consistent and things like that. At the same time, they're having to be more rigorous because of some of the issues the data centers cause with the grid from an operable standpoint. But you're still going to have a problem getting past sort of the construction timeline. It still takes time to get right of ways, buy equipment, engineer solutions, assemble all of that. You can only accelerate but so far with those kind of constraints. And I think it's right that the data center owners and developers can move faster with their solutions. Again, the question is how far can they go with theirs, right? How much can they shift their demand, for example? How much can they improve their efficiency? How fast? Things like that. I expect it's faster than the utility side. But I guess we'll all see, won't we?
Yeah, and I think so. What you're calling out there is essentially it's twofold, right? It's both on the process side, so the bureaucratic side, and then also on the technical side as well, right? In terms of getting better data, understanding the problem statement, and trying to connect these faster. Rhoda, your thoughts? So Rhonda, your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely see it coming from both sides. So the data centers are optimizing, and also the RTOs, the utilities, they are all trying to shorten the queue process. They're definitely working at it from both angles, as is the federal side, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which governs all of the transmission level exchanges and policies, particularly for the RTOs and ISOs. They're looking at this as well. So let me take this in two parts. On the generator interconnection side, yes, it can take 5 to 8, 10 years potentially when you look at the full construction time, but that can be shortened, and there are definitely very, very focused efforts to process that quicker. I had mentioned earlier the AI component of doing the power flow studies and the mitigations. That's helpful instead of having a human sitting there and going through the trial and error process. That can be automated, and that's been saving some time. There's also a couple tools. Again, I'll draw upon the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO, in the central U.S. So they have something called a provisional generator interconnection service, which is a product. They've had it for, a decade. And you can basically get connected and get online in 6 months. Of course, then you're up against your supply chain and your construction and those timelines. But from the policy side, the interconnection side, you can have a provisional generator interconnection very, very quickly within less than a year, and then it's up to you to build. Now, what happens, though, under this process is that you still are in the queue, and whatever the larger network upgrades are for that time period that you're planning to come online, you're still on the hook for those upgrades. So it is risky, and it's definitely companies that have an appetite for that risk, but I've been looking at the statistics, and over the last 5 years, we've seen a number of companies very successfully utilizing the provisional generator interconnection process in MISO, which maintains your queue position but allows you to come online immediately. There's a couple other tools. There's a generator replacement process. We see these aging coal plants. They're not economic anymore, and so they're coming offline. And as they come offline, there's a process where that interconnection service can be transferred to a new generator. And that is a very short process. Again, that's like a year and a half to get a GIA. And because that capacity is already reserved, it just has to stay within certain technical guidelines and it can't inject more power than at the existing interconnection service and some other technical parameters that it has to meet. Otherwise, it has to go get processed through the queue. But this is a very popular and very successful product all across the U.S., not just in the MISO region, but in basically most of the regions. So those are two tools that are really utilized on the generator interconnection side. And then I'd say on the data center side, what we're looking at, we're seeing this kind of policy. We're really just in the middle of it, but it's a bring your own generation. So you show up the load and the generation together, and there's a zero injection of power on the grid, and they're able to come together because they're meeting that on site at that same point of interconnection. These policies are they're really being looked at the federal level, but also at the regional level, and we're really right in the middle of that across the country. We've seen a number of these interconnections already completed in the Mid-Continent System, Mid-Continent Independent System Operator in MISO, and there's policy being developed to further refine that at this moment as we speak. There's also a federal effort and a number of other of the larger system operators that are looking at that. The other piece is the optimization, where you can take a system or a region and look at with the storage and really optimize that. And the ISOs and the utilities really aren't that sophisticated. So a lot of times you'll see the data centers coming online, and they'll have a number of tools and resources. Maybe they'll combine a cryptocurrency, which doesn't need 24/7 power availability. They can do an as available when the power is cheap cryptocurrency with a AI data center. So there's that kind of combination, and then you can further optimize it with storage. So you see them coming together and optimizing themselves, which ultimately I think the system operator needs to be thinking about that level of optimization in addition to their out-level transmission expansion planning. And I'll just conclude again by noting in the MISO system they do LRTP, long-range transmission planning, and they're looking at a 30-year out view, and they reassess those futures, and those futures estimate the load and the generation, and they've been doing this for well over a decade, and they're in that process right now where they're looking at a new set of futures. They're looking at what the estimated amount of load from data centers, from natural load growth for the cities, and then they're looking at storage and other resources as well.
And
Yeah,
just to add one corollary to that, which is you're beginning to see evidence of data center owners and developers buying old power plants, closed down power plants for the brownfield location benefits. So you've got a good location to build a new, better power plant. You've got great transmission interconnection. You might have the water you need if you're trying to build a fossil plant that requires cooling, things like that. And so increasingly the data centers are, whether they're going to operate them or not is, I think, still a bit of a question. They may have a subcontract, have someone else to actually do the operations, but they're definitely moving into a space where they're owning power to go with it, either through contract or physical sites themselves. It'll be interesting to see how the different players make that choice. But those brownfield, particularly old coal sites, old gas sites that are either shut down or will be soon just because they're not economic, are very attractive for development.
Yeah, I'll maybe just talk a little bit about the interconnection timelines. As Simon had mentioned, there's that process where there's the application, and then there's the study, and then there's the facilities, and then the construction time. So the area that I work in a lot is that application to the signing of the interconnection agreement, and there are the studies in the process. In those studies, the issue is that there's a cluster of projects, and it's a good number of projects, a good number of megawatts. And so there'll be a combined network upgrade set to support all of those projects that are trying to interconnect in that cluster class, in that study group. And within that group, if a single project drops out or multiple projects dropped out, it has to be restudied. and it takes time to restudy it, and then it changes everybody's economics. When people drop out, the cost can go down, and it can be better for everybody, or those costs can also, they can go up. But then if they go up, other projects may then need to drop, and then there's a cascading restudy issue. And really, that is the biggest issue to solve, is how to interconnect a group of projects and process them through without the restudies. And so some of the tools that are used in that are these very, very high non-refundable deposits. So you have to put up, to progress through the process, you have to really show that you're serious and you're committed, and there's a lot of money at risk. It can be tens of millions of dollars. It's always at minimum a few $1 million, but it's up to tens of millions of dollars. And if you drop out, then that money stays with the study group to keep that group together to offset those costs, so that it doesn't have to be retooled and everybody can go forward their costs with the costs that they were expecting. And so I think as we get better tools and we get better information, we're able to have more stable costs for those generators, and that helps to get the timeline down. Because, for example, in the MISO, it's a 1-year process nominally. So it should only take a year from application to having an agreement. But it takes longer because of the restudy process and the uncertainty and the cascading issues. So I think as we use the tools that we have, some of them are the AI tools, we can keep those study groups able to process the queues quicker.
You're seeing sort of a similar approach on the commercial side as well. You know, new tariffs are arranged for data centers that no longer are pay-as-you-go, sort of a traditional utility tariff. Now they're paying large upfront deposits. They're committing to 15-year terms, right, to make sure they stay committed, because everybody's very concerned that they may pull up stakes or change their business model and leave the ratepayer with what's in the industry known as a stranded asset, right? They spent a lot of money to build a bunch of assets that they won't get to recover the cost on. And maybe with the big guys, that's less of a concern, but as you move to some of the tier 2 and 3 data developers, that's some more of a concern. So you're seeing that kind of protection as well on the commercial side. Simon, are you back?
Yeah, I think I should be back. Can you guys hear me? Is
We
it all
can.
clear?
You sound
Yes,
fine.
we can hear you.
Okay, here we go.
Excellent.
Great, very good. My neighbor must be finished with his PlayStation game or something like that. Freed up my bandwidth. There you go. Very good. Sorry. So my original question, and I do want an answer for this, so I will push. So very shortly. So what do we think is realistic in terms of interconnection times? And I know we're really doubling down on this topic, but I think it's something worthwhile doing. What do we think is realistic? Do we think in the next 5 years we could get it down to maybe to 1 to 2 years or something like that? I mean, it would be good to get your perspective in what you guys are seeing.
You're defining that from initial request to final construction, or just through?
An initial request to final construction.
I mean, I
based
think
on the demand.
Well,
Based on the
construction's
demand.
like a year.
Reduce
I
the
mean,
pre-part of that a lot.
construction's like 9 months to a year.
Yeah, well, and construction can be a real challenge for, as I mentioned before, a number of reasons. It can be rights of way, equipment. A lot of the biggest equipment isn't even built in the U.S. anymore and hasn't been for 10 or 20 years. For example, some of the biggest substation components. It's from the generation side too. There's certain components that just haven't been built here in decades. And the changing tariff environment has absolutely impacted that, for example. So I don't know how much more you can compress the construction side. I say that because there's also going to be nationwide demand for the same equipment, the same construction equipment, the same trained trades. I'm going to need the same, electricians and mechanics and, all those guys. You can imagine they're going to be traveling around the country pretty steadily for the next 5 or 10 years, if they're smart, making an awful lot of money in the field, building all of this, right? Whether it's in MISO or New York or down the south, wherever it happens to be, those crews are going to roam and make money where they can go. I used to work in that business a long time ago, and those guys got paid very well to do that job. And I'm sure they're all sort of smiling at this. But the early part, the request to what would be FID, financial close, to actually go build something, certainly there's room to compress that a bit, to take that timeline with faster studies and improve the queue process, like Rhonda was saying. Certainly we can compress that side of the equation some, and we're working on that.
And in terms of a number, I mean, you think it's realistic to get this to 2-3 years from end to end?
With the right improvement of the process and then the standardization and the technology, I think it's doable within 2 to 3 years down the line. But getting consistency in 1 or 2 years to scale will be very challenging.
I think the data, if that's to happen, the data center side of the equation is going to need to pre-buy long lead items. They're going to need to buy substation components, generation if they're into that, if they're going to build generation. We actually saw this go back 25 years. Independent power producers were buying turbines long and putting them into warehouses, right, so that they were available to go to whichever site they wanted. The data center guys, if they want to accelerate the timeline, are going to have to get involved in that, because that's the critical path, and the utilities are not going to take that kind of risk. They can't.
I've seen. I think what we're seeing in the industry, particularly from the independent power producers and also from the hyperscalers, it's a grab, right? It's a grab on land, it's a grab on power, and it's a grab on chips, right? So how depending on the risk that they're willing to take, the upside is potentially huge, right? So it's how big is your current wallet, and how brave are you on that? This current dynamic that we're seeing is going to last like the next 5-10 years.
I mean, you're
right?
paying $25 million for a slot fee to get a turbine built these days, so they're starting to think that way.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, just as a quick reminder to the viewers, please put your Q&A questions. We're going to do one more question from the panelists, and then I'm going to switch over to the Q&A from the audience. So please don't forget to get your questions inside the system. So the last question, and this is definitely going to be a tricky one, right? I mean, in terms of we've touched on it a little bit, right? But essentially, how let's frame up what does a high functioning partnership between hyperscalers and the utilities, and also I guess you can include government in this one, actually look like in terms of a technical and operational level, right? So things like forecasting, co-investment, data sharing, really optimizing all of the above, right? So how closely do we think that they're going to work, and do you think that they will even be able to do this, right, in terms of developing tight relationships? Because like I said at the top of the meeting, different horses for courses, and different end games, right? Hyperscalers want to build as quick as possible, want to monetize. Utility companies are also in the game, but they also need to make a profit. And then you have governments who are just trying to manage this whole thing. So how tightly do we think that these three partners can couple together? And what does good look like?
So
I think Rhonda, so Rajkumar, go ahead.
Okay. At high level, the strong partnership means moving from transactional relationship to the truly integrated operational model. On technical side, it starts with the data sharing and forecasting. And operational side, it's co-investment model. And so the key shift from working silo to coordinated ecosystem.
Thank you, Rajkumar. Rhonda, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing a lot of the utilities and the data centers working together closely. I think they're able to kind of mutually meet each other's needs. As you noted, the data centers, they want to come online quickly, and the utilities, they make a rate of return on the infrastructure. They make money on supplying that load and on that process. So I think we're definitely seeing a lot there. I think it is important that there is an element of regulation, because there needs to be some standardization and some predictability. I think it's ultimately going to be a benefit to the data centers to have that standardization, even though right now it's very tempting to make these backroom deals because they are not publicly available. It's not like generator interconnection, which is a process, and there's an oversight element within the industry, and it's predictable. I think right now there's a real partnership, but it's really out of sight, and there's really not much oversight at this point between the utilities and the data centers. Mm-hmm. And as we develop the standardization, I think it's going to be mm-hmm. for everybody's benefit. It's going to be for the long-term benefit, and it's going to be reliability. And a key thing here is, how do they calculate their peak load, and do they net it out with, the generation, and it's different between different utilities, and if they're not using the same metrics, then we're not planning for resource adequacy, and the states all plan for resource adequacy, but the utility uses the plans of the states, and if they're not using the same metrics, for the long-term reliability and stability of the bulk electric system of the United States, we really need this standardization, and we really need transparency, similar to what we have in the generator interconnection process.
Yeah, very good. I think it sounds like a consortium is needed, right? An industrial consortium where we need to get the main players in a room talking to each other, and potentially that's happening, but I think it needs to happen on a deeper level. Holt, we're just very close to time, so if you could give us a few minutes on your thoughts, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Well, I'd agree that the partnership is beginning in a number of different ways. Certainly, the data center guys are working to standardize their designs on higher amperage designs and more common sort of modular designs. So they're working with equipment suppliers and those sorts of folks to standardize what they want to build, and that's good. That's helpful because those are not only helps them from a construction standpoint, a cost perspective, but also from a power requirement perspective. It'll help standardize how all that moves through the study process, if you will. It'll make the study process quicker and more efficient. They are working with utilities and the RTOs reasonably to a degree. They are still very protective of anything that looks competitive. So, the shapes of loads and things like that, they really don't like to share. But if they want the process to move faster, they're going to have to open up on some of these things, maybe under, more legal protections and things like that. But it leaves, when they don't want to share that kind of information, it leaves the utilities nervous and with the feeling that they're carrying an awful lot of risk. And you got to remember, the number one job of the utility is safe, reliable power supply. And, they have to ensure that, right? Number one job is grandma doesn't get cold in the winter, okay? Mm-hmm. And they face the brunt absolutely. Of that if something happens, right? The data centers don't. It's the utilities that face that. And then the politicians who are on top of all that will also face it as well, right? So there's a lot of people that care if the utilities don't serve, right? If something really goes wrong.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so we're just going to do one question from the Q&A section, question from Robert. And we're at time, so if you could just be very succinct in your answers, we'd appreciate that. So what are the key milestone policy regulation hurdles to jump in compliance for new or emergent clean power generation approaches? And I do realize that renewable energy and clean power we haven't touched at all, right? So have you guys got that question? What are the key milestone policy regulation hurdles to jump in compliance for new or emergent clean power generation approaches? And we will start with Rhonda.
I think it depends on what type of clean power it is. If it's new or emergent, the generator interconnection processes, they're FERC regulated, and so as long as you have the models, you're going to need like a PSSE model, a PSCAD model, and you can follow the process and you can fill the form out, then you should be able to come online. So again, I'd have to see what is the generation in particular, but there is a process that is laid out, and it should be able to work for any new generation as long as you can meet the requirements as they exist.
Perfect. Holt?
So I'll go after one policy area. There's a lot of talk about nuclear supporting AI, certainly viable down the road, but it's still a bit early on the nuclear side. I mean, there are there are options where, again, nuclear PPAs are being signed on existing nuclear facilities. There's maybe 5 or 6 of those. But some of the new small modular reactor technology is not quite there yet. It's moving very well, very quickly, don't get me wrong. But I don't think it's going to solve the 5-year problem. It may be more like 7, 8 years out on the short term, and maybe a bit longer. A lot of that really depends on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission allowing for an operator's license for the first of those couple of new design reactors, because they are different reactor designs, different fuel designs.
Yeah, perfect. Rajkumar?
Yeah, I would say the complex permitting, like federal, state, and local, and environmental regulations. So, and also the lack of standardization across the regions. So those are the policy regulations, I would say.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. That's all we've got time today. I think to summarize, I think that one of the key takeaways for me is really on this partnership, right? Is really the partnership between the hyperscalers and all of the other parties that are involved, right? I think that's something that really only working together is the way that they can solve these kind of large issues that we've been discussing today. So thanks very much to the audience. I hope you've enjoyed the panel today, and thank you to our guests. And we can close out the session.